Hello and welcome. Today we're going to look at a game played by me in the Michigan Class Championships. It was actually my last round game. My opponent was rated 1887, and I'm not going to share my opponent's name, but anyway, I played my last round opponent. And my opponent began the game with 1e4, which was the opening that I was more concerned about with this tournament. I was thinking about how do I want to approach e4 in the game. And my idea was to play knight to c6, and I assumed that my opponent would then play d4, and I was going to play d5. And I'd done a lot of analysis on this and different possible positions, such as those that happen after e5, or knight to c3, or f3, or pawn takes pawn. So I looked at several different variations with this, and I was excited when I saw my opponent play e4. But unfortunately for me, my opponent's next move was knight to f3. And this already changed my preparation. I'm not going to be able to play d5 and get the same positions I was looking at, so I decided instead to revert into more of a perk defense. I didn't want to play a symmetrical king pawn opening, so I go into a perk, and as I look at this I begin to wonder, the knight on c6, how am I going to feel about this a few moves from now as we go through this opening? And it's odd right away to open up a available pin on your knight for your opponent. And I remember thinking that during the game. I'm like, this is interesting, but we'll just go through these moves. Okay, so what have I accomplished? I've got a knight on c6, and I haven't castled yet. I want to get castled. and now this particular position I've had many times. I oftentimes play knight out to c6 to tempt d5 with the idea of just retreating my knight back. So I play the knight back to b8. And then that knight is going to come to d7, and then because that pawn was moved to d5, I'll have the choice of maybe going to c5 or e5, and I'll have a good game and good squares for my pieces. So anyway, I'm playing with this idea, and my opponent plays here bishop to b3. And this might at first look familiar to if you're a Roy Lopez player, or maybe you saw some lines in a Sicilian that have this. But what makes this different is there's no activity of my queen on this file, let's say. So the queen's not going to come to c7. There's no exchanged pawn on c7. So that bishop really isn't harassable on c4 quite the same way as it would be in those other openings. Additionally, this move just gave up the control of this diagonal over here. So there's no longer light square support. This makes my next move kind of easy to spot, just bishop to g4, with the idea of pinning this knight. And this is a very, very uncomfortable pin for white, because again, he can't play the bishop over to break it, and a simple move here like h3 would allow bishop takes knight, and then I could follow that up with knight takes pawn after a queen capture. And of course, if the g pawn takes, then the king pawns are doubled. And that might not seem like that big of a deal. In a lot of games it isn't a huge deal to have doubled pawns, but you obviously have to play carefully when that does occur. So bishop came out to e3, my knight went back to d7, and this is with ideas of having both knights then able to come to e5 and give support to my e5 push. And it also brings the bishop in, so the bishop now is helping to control against those dark squares. So I'm trying to exploit the fact that this knight is going to be disappearing from the board, and then I may be able to pile up with attackers on that d4 pawn. So my opponent plays bishop to d2, and I capture the knight. So the pawns on the king side are doubled, and then I hold those pawns with e5. The move played here was a blunder. Bishop to g5, and I remember when this move was made, I immediately noticed that my pawn is pinned by this bishop on the light squares, so I'm not able to just block this with f6 and then take on d4. So I began thinking, well, what choices do I have? And at first I was thinking, okay, I got to move the queen. So I was kind of considering maybe different squares for my queen, and then I started thinking about how uncomfortable it was that maybe the knight could come in and harass the c7 pawn. And if my queen goes to e8, let's say, then the c7 pawn is going to be harassable. And I'm thinking about this for a while, and where do I move the queen? Where do I move the queen? Where do I move the queen? And then it suddenly occurs to me that I don't necessarily have to move my queen here. And I play bishop to f6. And this is the real test, because if white captures that bishop, then my queen will recapture, and I'll have pressure on both f3 and d4. My knight attacking d4 and the queen attacking f3. And there's no way to stop the loss of a pawn. So So my opponent, I think somewhat logically, plays bishop to h6, threatening to win the exchange. And I play an intermediate move here, knight takes d4. This is a pretty obvious move. I'm going to threaten this pawn with the idea of forking the king and the queen. So my opponent needs to respond to that threat. King to g2 is a choice. My opponent played queen to e3. And I'm looking at the position, and I kind of decided that giving the exchange may actually give me a lot of dark square control, so I played c6. My opponent took, and now bishop to g5. And if white plays passively here, if white retreats this queen to any of these squares, then my idea was pretty simple. I was just going to play my bishop over here to h4, maybe get the queen over here, and notice there's a nice mate threat that is rather hard to parry in that case, right? So my opponent sees that he shouldn't just give up control of the king side, so f4 is played, bishop takes, and now queen to h3, and now I recapture the bishop. So we look at this position. I'm down the exchange, but I've gained 2 pawns, really well-placed pieces. I've got nice control in the center with this knight and this bishop, and all 3 of these pieces, minor pieces of mine, can all get to f4. So I have very strong control over f4, and white's pieces here are kind of out of a defensive role. His light squared bishop that normally would be maybe over here is over on the in front of his b pawn, and the placement of the bishop makes this decision to go into this exchange sack a little bit easier, because I'm going to have 2 minor pieces and a queen attacking a queen and a king, and then it's going to be pretty pleasant to have that attack, and also knowing that in the end, if everything gets traded down, I've got a knight and 2 pawns versus a rook, which I'd much rather have those 2 than the rook. So play continues with rook a to e8, and now I played queen to f6. There's some ideas here. If I was to say like move the bishop, I would be threatening knight to f3 check with the fork on the king and queen, or king and rook rather. But it's not even really necessarily even about that. It's just about putting my pieces on active squares and just looking for my opportunities here. So the knight comes back to b1. I really had expected knight to e2 there to maybe challenge the minor pieces I had on the board, maybe try to get some exchanges. So I play knight to e6. And you might wonder, well, why am I allowing the exchange of pieces? I'm down the exchange. My thinking is that a minute ago, this bishop on b3 is actually performing a bit of a role with the pin here, and my knight on f8 needs to get active, and I want to get active as quickly as possible. Additionally, when he captured my knight, my other knight is now ready to be redirected to, say, g5 or f4 and help me continue my attack. So pawn to c3, h5, knight to a3, and here I played bishop back to h6. A waiting move, but also clearing the way for my knight, because now my threat is knight to g5, which would attack the queen, and then this f3 square, again with the idea of forking the king and rook. So my opponent needs to respond to that idea. He plays f3. And at first it's like, well, what could black do in this position, right? What threats are there? And the move that I made is bishop to d2. A pretty innocent looking move at first. You know, maybe you just think, well, I could play rook to e2, and then I could play rook to d1, but the truth is this move is extremely powerful. White now has to give back the exchange. Let's look at some variations here. If my opponent had played rook to e2, I would have a nice move knight to f4, controlling the g2 square, so that the queen isn't able to move back to guard the rook. And additionally, should the queen go to g3 to stop my mate threat, then I would have knight takes rook, check, winning the queen. So it's important to note too that moves like queen to d7 aren't going to work because of queen to g5 check, and then when the queen ends up on g2, we'll have mate, or in this line the rook would just die again. Knight takes rook would, win the game. So I guess I'm looking at another variation. If he'd played rook to d1, then that's probably what I was thinking of. There's a nice mating net here after knight up, queen down, queen checks. And if the king goes here, then this is mate, because that bishop I put on d2 is controlling these 2 squares. So fortunately for my opponent, he sees this threat. He sees the idea that moving the rook is just bad. It's either going to drop the queen or give up the game. So he just says, you know what, I'm up the exchange right now. I'm going to give back the exchange. and the move knight to c4 is played. Get that piece back in the game. I play bishop takes on e1. The rook took on e1. And now my finishing move, knight to g5. And this, of course, threatens both the f3 pawn and the queen. And when the knight takes on f3, that'll fork the king and the rook. So white here would probably play the move queen to f1, but then there's just queen takes f3. And you might start thinking, well, isn't white maybe in a position where he can start getting back some of these pawns, because you could play a move like knight takes d6, right? Well, actually no. The move knight to d6 loses to knight to h3, where the king isn't really mated, but he has no squares, so the queen would have to sacrifice to stop that attack. So knight takes d6 isn't possible, and of course queen takes queen fails to knight recaptures, forking the king and the rook. So white is just completely lost in this position after knight to g5. And that's why in the game my opponent resigned at this point. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson, and I hope that you'll look for these type of ideas in your own games of giving an exchange for an attack. Thank you.